Hi, everyone. This is Miss Woodard, and we are talking again about South Carolina history and the slave economy. It's what we're talking about next. So hold on to your seatbelts.
You say my ancestors were imperfect, when deep inside I know you used our beautiful perfection to make your pockets grow. The blood, the sweat, and the tears, the deplorable journey to get here. Erase my place in history? What a pity to only think you can be so slick. Honey, guess what? We built this country brick by brick. Can't you hear our ancestors? Can you hear the chains? All the men, women, and the babies that drowned. We'll never ever know their names. I feel it deep down inside of me. These people were a part of me. Oh yes, we will remember the backs of our ancestors. The torn flesh and shattered dreams. The desire to be liberated. The aching on the inside to be free. The longing to be educated. The passion to learn to read. Babies torn from my ancestors' arms. Families purposely broken apart. Denied the right to exist. Denied the right to live. Don't look people in their eyes. Walk on the other side of the street. Sit all your hinder parts all the way on that back seat. You're not good enough. Your ice isn't as cold as theirs. Your nose and lips are too big. Do something with that nappy hair. Yeah, man, that's what they told me. But I tell you what I tell myself. Someone died for me. This life I now live was their dream. So I don't waste my life. I'll get my actions in line. I won't let your agenda change my mind. A beautiful rainbow of colors and hues is one result of all of your abuse. We are cocoa, black, coffee, hazelnut, pecan, honey, tan, coconut, earth, and coal. We are perfectly made, even though at one time we were slaves.
Okay, so that was a poem that I wrote entitled We Were Slaves, and that's going to introduce the Middle Passage for us today. So that's what we're going to be focusing on, what happened to the slaves during the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is part of the triangular trade route, and as you can see right here, where it says that line that says slaves down there, slaves were taken from the west coast of Africa and brought all the way over to the southern colonies as well as to the West Indies or to the Caribbean, as we call it today. That was a leg of the triangular trade route. And it's also known or noted that when slaves would jump out of the ship, or if they were thrown overboard because they were sick, that the sharks actually changed their migration habits and they started following slave ships. So a lot of people that got put overboard for whatever reason and various reasons were actually eaten by sharks. And that's one of the reasons why we have a lot of sharks now in the Atlantic Ocean. All right, so we're dealing with the Middle Passage, and this is some gruesome stuff. All right. So, the Middle Passage was where British firms brought slaves from local chiefs or traders in Africa. They loaded them on ships and took them to the West Indies, and there were many that were taken to America. So, if you look at these two pictures at the bottom, there's a picture of a ship on the right hand side, and on the left hand side, there's a view of what the hull or the bottom of the ship looked like. So, they would store the cash crops and rum and different things in the bottom, and in that middle layer under the deck, they would store the slaves. So that's where the slaves had to live during that passage across the Atlantic Ocean. The voyage was so dangerous that 1 out of 6 Africans died on the voyage. Okay, so it was a dangerous voyage. Again, these were not metal ships or anything that we're thinking about today, like a carnival cruise. These were wooden ships that were sealed tight with that pine and tar and pitch and rosin that got harvested from South Carolina and North Carolina. And these ships were wooden. Okay, so it was a dangerous voyage, and a lot of Africans died on the way over here. If we look at the Middle Passage and we look at this chart that's right here, there was this chart represents the slave trade journey in days. So if you came from Senegambia, it took you about 34 days to travel from the coast of Africa to Jamaica. If you look at the next column, there's Sierra Leone at the bottom. It took you about 52 days on a ship to travel from the coast of Africa to Jamaica. Jamaica is not too far from Florida. All right, also 56 days if you came from the Gold Coast to travel from the coast of Africa to Jamaica. And then finally, we have about 62 days if you came from the Congo. It took you about 62 days, which is roughly 2 months for the most part, to travel from the coast of Africa to Jamaica. So that does not include the time that they spent when they actually captured the slaves in Africa and marched them all the way to the West Coast. So if you add a couple of more months on that, that's a long time for you to be away from your family and to be without proper food and clothing and etc. So it was a gruesome journey. And again, it took roughly 2 to 3 months to get across the water to Jamaica or to the West Indies. All right, we have right here a picture of slave ship conditions. I showed you the front view in that picture before that last slide. This is actually a top view of how they would line the slaves up in the hull or the bottom of the ship. So they had head to foot, and they chained you down. And if you were sick in front of everybody. Going to the bathroom, you had to use the bathroom, you used it right there. So imagine just laying there in somebody else's feces or someone else's urine. It was pretty bad. It was pretty awful. And they would bring you up every so often to make you exercise. But we'll talk more about that in the next slides, okay? So they line people up in the bottom of these ships, like we see right here. This is a diagram of how you pack your slaves into a slave ship. All right, so slave ship conditions. Slaves were kept and placed below the deck. So it wasn't on top of the deck like we think of a Titanic and, Leonardo DiCaprio hanging off the end of the ship talking about he's the king of the world. This was not that, okay? These people were under the deck. You were under the deck. All right, if you see that picture on the right-hand side, this is like a drawing of maybe a slave ship where some slaves are being lifted up over the deck. But slaves had little room and they could not breathe the fresh air, the fresh sea air that was outside. So they were under the deck. There were 50 or 60 slaves. They were fastened to one chain in order to prevent them from rising or endeavoring to escape. So if they wanted to escape, let's just say there were 10 of us chained together. All 10 of us would have to want to escape. Because if one of us didn't want to, we'd have to drag that one person on a chain with us. Okay? So just think about being chained to everybody in this classroom and you having to have one mind to say you're going to try to escape. All right. The slavers controlled what the slaves ate, drank, and when they did what they did. So you couldn't do anything unless the slaver allowed you to do so. Okay. So their diet consisted largely of horse beans and rice. Horse beans, if you want to know what those look like, take a side note, put this on pause. Go online and look up horse beans, and you'll see that they're pretty big. All right, so that horse beans and rice is what they ate. Water was restricted to 24 ounces a day. 24 ounces of water per day. That's not a lot of water, okay? Especially for you to be hot, for you to be in the middle of the ocean. You don't have air to breathe that's fresh, and you're only allowed 24 ounces of water per day. The slavers forced the slaves to exercise or dance at times to maintain some of their physical stature. So in order to keep their muscles up, you have to move. If not, your muscles go into atrophy and you can't use them properly. It's like if you get a broken arm and you put it in the cast and then you take the cast off, your arm's all shriveled up and you kind of got to work that arm to get the muscles built back. So think about being in the bottom of a slave ship for a while and you haven't been able to exercise and move. Your muscles are going to shrink. So the slavers would make them come on deck and actually exercise. And we'll watch a video that's a short version of that exercise. All right, so slaves resisted being enslaved, and we're also going to talk about the conditions on the slave ship. All right, so one common reaction for a slave was to try to kill themselves if they didn't want to go and be a slave. Uh, a lot of ways they did this was by refusing to eat. But if they refused to eat, the slavers would forcefully open their mouth and insert the food. Again, you'll see this on a video that we'll watch a little bit later. They tortured the slaves until they could no longer stand the pain if they wanted to refuse to eat, too, as well. Okay. Number two, some people jumped off the ship to drown in the Atlantic Ocean. And some people believe that they will be brought back to their native land and receive their freedom once again if they jumped overboard. But like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, a lot of the sharks changed their migrating patterns because of the fact that so many people were jumping overboard or being thrown overboard because they were sick or for one various reason or the other. So a lot of sharks would eat those people that would jump overboard. Right. The third way that they resisted was some of them united together and they rebelled against the crew and the captains. And we saw this actually happen in that movie called Amistad, where this was actually based on a true story, where these slaves rose up on the slave ship and they overpowered the people that had the ship, and they steered the ship to the Americas, and they got defended, and they eventually granted their freedom. Didn't happen that often. There are instances. If you're interested in that, you can always look that up on your own. Okay. All right, the slaves were used to their religion to pray for survival and even place curses on the crew so that the slaves could be freed. So they wanted to use their religion to pray for their survival. So a lot of them were kind of spiritual people. And again, they wanted to be freed. All right. The resistance, though, caused slavers to impose more restrictions to prevent uprisings and individual resistance. Okay, so again, the more they resisted, the worse conditions got for the slaves that had been captured on those slave ships. So it wasn't a very good thing for them to be captured and actually to live or to try to live on that middle passage voyage. All right, and you do need to know this stuff. All right, Sullivans Island. So a lot of them, when they reached America, they came in through Sullivans Island. So between 1709 and 1799, slaves were quarantined or brought into a room or into a building for diseases in pest houses on Sullivan's Island. So if you came and you arrived on the ship, and when you got off, if you were sick, they would quarantine you or block you off from everybody on Sullivan's Island. Sullivan's Island is not too far from Fort Moultrie, not too far from Charleston, South Carolina. Okay. All right. So about 10 to 12 million Africans were forced to immigrate or forced to leave their homeland and come over to the United States to work for free. All right, about 4 to 6% ended up in North America between 1619 and 1808. So that's about 400,000 to 720,000 slaves actually crossed the Atlantic and lived and survived and made it over to North America. Roughly 40% of those people came through Charleston when they came to the Americas. So about 40% of the 400,000 to 720,000 came through Charleston through that slave market. In Charleston, there were port physicians that inspected incoming ships to protect the settlement in Charleston from contagious diseases. So people had things like smallpox, etc., that they gotten sick from while they were on these ships. So they had a doctor there to inspect the ships to make sure that they weren't bringing those diseases on, because if the diseases came to the Americas, they would wipe out the population. All right, so if a ship was suspected of carrying infection, the passengers were then isolated into that pest house there on Sullivan's Island. Okay, the first pest houses were built around 1707. If you ever go to Fort Sullivan or Sullivan Island, it's like a little eerie type of feeling when you're out there. I don't know. Maybe it's just because you know that that's where they actually brought all those slaves in and where they first touched land. And if they were sick, they had to stay there until they got better or they died. So again, Sullivan Island housed pest houses where if there was a disease on board ship, they would isolate those people and make them stay there. All right, so the slave mart in Charleston. So many slaves were brought from Sullivan's Island to Charleston to be sold. And these slaves were sold on auction tables that are about 3 feet high and about 10 feet long. And they were placed the long way or lengthwise, so slave owners could pass by these different people during the auction. A humiliating thing for people to have to go through. You know, you're standing up there, you're barely clothed, if you have clothes at all, and people are poking and prodding and you know, just looking at you to see whether or not you're fit for their service. So again, this was the slave mart in Charleston, South Carolina, where all of this happened. And you see the pictures of it right there on the right hand side. There was a slave who had a story. I'm going to try to pronounce his name. Hola Da El Quano. He was born in West Africa, and he was born to a slave to an African family. He was sold to British slave traders, and then he was traded on the Middle Passage to America, and he was sold to the highest bidder. After working in Virginia, he was sold to a British naval officer, and his master let him keep some of the money from odd jobs he did for others. Equano eventually earned enough money to purchase his freedom. That was allowed back then. In England, he learned how to read and write, and in 1789, he published his autobiography. So, if you're interested in finding out, you know, a little bit more firsthand knowledge or an autobiography about the slave trade and about the effects of the slave trade on African Americans or on Africans in period, you can check out this guy's biography or autobiography. All right, for your assignment for this particular video, I want you to tell me what you see happening in this picture. This is a portrait of a slave auction happening in Charleston, South Carolina. So just type a paragraph based on what you see in this picture, okay? And submit that on Canvas.